my name's Simon Lamb. I live in England, in Dorset in the West Country, and I have spent all my life deeply concerned with environmental issues. And I've also spent a great deal of time thinking and writing about it from a science perspective. A number of things started me on this long course that I've taken that ended up in the writing of a book called Junglenomics, which was published about 4 years ago. And it's really started in my youth when I used to read in my early teens about reports from people like Jacques Cousteau or Heyerdahl, and of course then the famous book by Rachel Carlson, The Silent Spring, and those things affected me at the time, but I was probably too young and having too good a time to really take a huge amount of notice of it. And I met my wife in very early on, actually aged about 14 years old, and we after many a breakup, we ended up getting married, and we went to live in North Wales, which is pretty wild and woolly area of the country, and we knew it was temporary, but it was a glorious place to live, wonderful scenery. And there was an event that happened there, which I suppose kick-started me on really thinking deeply about the ecological problems that the world suffers from. And I had bought her for a present, a small puppy. And after about a week, that puppy suddenly went missing. And I was devastated. She was devastated. We'd already grown very fond of it. And it was still very small and vulnerable. So behind us, the hills stretched over quite a way with moorland and the odd patches of woodland and lakes. So we set off there, crack of dawn, really was very early, just before light, the next morning to look for this puppy, and eventually happened upon a absolutely remarkable place. It was a small lake. It was surrounded by trees and shrubs and wildflowers, and it was absolutely alive with bird song and with insects. And if we hadn't been on a more serious mission, we would have stayed a great deal longer. And we just thought, what a wonderful spot. It's completely wild, completely lost. Nobody ever comes here. There's no beaten paths. So we went on along a hill path and came across another stretch of wood. This one was an extraordinary contrast. I learned later that it had been ancient woodland, oak woodland, and most of North Wales was covered in oak forest once. And it had been completely cleared and replaced with conifers, planted a couple of yards apart from each other. Nothing grew on the ground, just regiments of trees, not a sound, not an animal moved. And when we shouted for our dog, it just echoed through the emptiness. And I'm glad to say that the puppy was eventually recovered, but that contrast stuck with me and stuck with me for a long time. I had been very interested, always have been, in Darwinian evolution. And also I was educated as an economist. I spent my early days working in investment management, a management company in London before I had moved out to North Wales. And so I had a sort of footing in both the environmental world and because I was so concerned with what I saw happening around me, like the complete destruction of that piece of woodland, and also with evolution and with economics. And it was that conjunction of economics with evolution, with environmental destruction, which came in due course to make me start to look at their relationship a great deal closer. And the more I looked at it, the more I realized that there was a massive overlap between evolution, Darwinian evolution, and between economics. In fact, ecosystems and economic systems, I began to realize, are incredibly alike. In fact, they're not just alike. I actually went further to realize they are the same. One is an evolved version of the other, which happened through the process of the advent of agriculture and the advent of exchange, and eventually that would be barter, and eventually of money. Through agriculture, we became accumulators of surplus. And it's that surplus, that desire to have more than our basic needs. And for thousands of years, we lived as hunter-gatherers with no need for anything more than our basic needs. And that's not to say that this development was bad, but it allows us an insight into how economic systems work. And when we have a massive problem, as we do today, which is undeniably an emergency, both due to climate change and due to biological loss, biodiversity loss, we have to understand, in order to address anything, in my view, being sort of science and economics based, there is no point even trying to address these problems unless you really understand where they come from and what they're about. And so that is what I began to think about and began to write about. And a particular understanding came to me that actually my first part of the book, which has been hived off, my book Junglenomics, is called The Engine of Evolution, and is being published, and is nearly finished and is being published. It's a prequel to Junglenomics. Explains why we behave the way we do, why all animals behave the way they do. Essentially, it's about resource colonization. And it is that drive which is in our genes and is very, very ancient. I mean, we're talking billions of years. We're talking about the very beginnings of life. That drive to colonize resources, to acquire and colonize resources, underlies the whole of species evolution of life on Earth, and unsurprisingly, it carries through into the economic dimension that followed. And so I started my work on how to address these problems from that essential understanding, that there is something bigger than us driving us to what we do. Yes, there are avaricious people, but you so often hear people blaming corporate greed, blaming individual greedy people. There are those people. Of course, those people exist. They exist in every country, but that isn't the driving force that causes our destruction, causes us to destroy the thing we know we depend on to survive in the long term. So that was my initial premise for the book, and that was my beginning of my understanding of what goes on in economies. And from there on, it became a matter of developing policy to cater for this drive that underlies both ecosystem and economic activity. So the principles that are involved, and we have to take it, if we take a science-based approach, is that underlying our problems, as an economist, if you look at it, and economists agree on this, that markets are at the source of the problem. And markets are where you exchange goods for cash, or sometimes goods for other goods, but the barter system is mostly gone. So cash becomes the universal resource. And it is because it's in our genes, and because agriculture taught us to strongly desire surplus, because as an agriculturalist, you need to set up surplus. You can't, your crops grow at a certain time of year, you have to store. And if you store more than you need, that is a better survival strategy than surviving just as much or just in time. And so there's a certain point in our history, and we do know roughly when it was, because in Europe, we start to find pieces of jewelry and votive offerings. And we start to see that human beings began to value things outside the essential basics, those essential basics that all life depends on, which is food and shelter and protection and water and air, of course. And it started to become something that became valued. And that pursuit of luxury, of surplus goods, actually drove us in a direction that has resulted in all the problems we have today. And again, I'm not criticizing it saying it's bad, it's just part of human development. And that is that luxury evolved to take the place over necessity. And if it's anything you can think of, whether it's a bottle of root beer or whether it's a Chateau Lafite champagne, whether it's a rubber ring or whether it's a luxury yacht, makes no difference. None of that is necessary in the survival sense. And all these things are surplus to needs. So nevertheless, markets developed to provide these things. They basically developed to provide what you and I want and what we want to buy. And you know, we couldn't have this conversation if people weren't making profits out of doing this. We wouldn't have the computer, we wouldn't have the electricity, we wouldn't have the technology, we wouldn't have the clothes I'm wearing, we wouldn't have anything if it wasn't for people making profits. So anybody who cares to sort of damn profit making and say, oh, it's all about really people making profits, I'm sorry, that's how the world works, it's how nature works. Nature works on a profit of nutrients, and you have to, and nature, you need, say, for example, if you are a polar bear, you need to eat more meat than you need to survive because you need an energy supply. So you are actually creating a profit out of the nutrients that you consume. And that's the same throughout nature. But when you move into economics, if a polar bear runs out of food, or any other animal, a lion can't find enough gazelle, or it kills too many gazelle, becomes so efficient that it kills all the gazelle in its area. Nature has a very brutal way of dealing with that. It's simply, they die, they go extinct. 99% of all species that have ever existed have gone extinct. And we're on the road to becoming the next one, unless we do something about it. And the reason that we're on that road is because we're so hugely efficient. Our technology is superb. We can kill every last gazelle. We can kill every last seal, whatever it is we depend on. We can eat every last blade of grass that we depend on. It doesn't matter because we are avatars. Our occupations are like being a species as an art dealer, which I've spent a lot of my time being, most of my life as one of my professions. I need certain things, I think in certain ways, I need certain expertise. I become, in effect, a creature in the economic ecosystem. But I only do it because it's profitable. There are obviously people who do things for philanthropic reasons, and I'm not saying that everybody's driven by money, because many people are not, and many people do have the time and energy to spend on doing things for no return at all, as I'm doing with my efforts now. I have various plans and various policies that I don't stand to benefit from, but my genes do, I believe, if it's better for my children. So yeah, there is an interest. I might be around to see the changes, but at least I know that my descendants, I hope, will be. So as avatars, when we run out of something, we don't go extinct as they do in animals. All we do is change our clothes. We change, in equivalent to saying, well, I was a gazelle yesterday, I'm going to be a zebra today because there's plenty of zebra food out there. It isn't. So what happens is we can exhaust our resources. And if we're surviving out of cutting and logging trees, for example, or a paper mill, which involves cutting and logging trees, we can then say, well, we cut all the trees down. We've got no access to any more trees. That's okay, we'll move on to something else. But nevertheless, we still look within our ecosystem, we look at those trees as an opportunity. And we look at standing trees, not doing the wrong thing. We look at not cutting down trees in our area where we happen to live in the Brazilian Cerrado or wherever it may be. We look at those and we say it's an opportunity, what economists call an opportunity cost. By not cutting them down, we are missing out on the profit that we would make, and that is called an opportunity cost. That is what's wrong with the whole system, that we value things that are valuable in a different way, not in a financial way, but to maintain the the world's habitability, we value those things in a totally separate context to our business world. So in order to change this, we have to change the way markets look at these things. We have to have them look at a rainforest and say, no, that's more valuable standing than it is felled. That the people looking after that rainforest are more valuable working in that rainforest than they are in some menial task that I might give them in a logging mill. It is about changing the whole approach to markets, and that is what I'll come to in a moment, is the most important thing that only governments can do to change the parameters of profitability in our economic ecosystem. So what do we do about this problem? If we understand what its roots are, as I believe I do, and many other people do, how do we actually address it in practical terms? Because we don't have a lot of time to play. There are people who have all sorts of theories, and they're very fine, many of them, and they're very sensible. I mean, there's donut economics is the first one that comes to mind. These are all very principled economic systems that are, to my mind, a little naive, because we're not going to get 168 countries in the world to adopt this overnight. And what we actually need is overnight solutions. It isn't going to be good enough to have something that develops over the next 50 or 100 years and becomes some world revolution. There's a British writer called George Monbiot who's always saying the whole thing will be cured with some big socialist revolution. So I don't know how that works worldwide, because certainly in Britain, where only about 2% of the world's problems, it's still significant, but very small. So we tend to work in this country by setting examples, trying to set examples of doing the right thing. I believe we don't do nearly enough. But the answer is that we have to be pragmatic and we have to be fast. And that means today's solution, something you can do tomorrow. Policies you can apply. And if you look on my website at junglenomics.com, you will see 12 principles of Junglenomics. You also see about 65 policies there, some of which in the UK have been adopted, and some are being adopted in the US and around the world as well. I wish I could say it's a result of my activities, but you never know what subliminal messages get through, or third-party messages get through. So that one of the main principles is, of course, businesses are rightly geared to profit. And I've established that the values are skewed, though, and businesses are not bad people. They have a responsibility to their workers, they have a responsibility to their shareholders, and to themselves and their families to make profits. And it would be nice to say to them, oh, this, you should stop doing that. It's legal, but you shouldn't do it. And so as a result of stop doing whatever it is they do, importing X, Y, or Z perhaps, their profits are slashed. Investors don't want to know there's more profitable companies, but they have to cut down their workforce. It's the same with big oil. People say, we have a movement here that says just stop oil. You can't just stop oil. This is a transition. One thing that humans are great at is adaptation. So we have to adapt our way out. We have to transition our way out. We do that as fast as possible. But if you cut out oil ahead of the demand, you simply leave people with not enough power, with businesses going bankrupt, with people in poverty, because energy is at the core, as we know, of all our economies, because energy supplies. And we've had a warning recently, particularly in Europe, about through Ukraine war, of what can happen so quickly. So we are becoming more self-sufficient in energy. And I'm glad to see that in the States, they're doing exactly the same. And that the emphasis is on clean energy. Now, as that develops, the big oil companies will, for example, have what's called stranded assets. Investors won't want to know about however big the companies were, about a company that has a termination date. Of course, there'll always be oil needed to make plastics and other things to a certain degree, but nothing like the quantities that are required, still required around the world. So the answer is the economics will change that. That the big beasts, the big competitors that come in and become bigger than them, outcompete them and replace them in that marketplace, just as species did in the past. They will become the dinosaurs, not overnight, as some people want, because we don't really want it to be hit by a very large flying object and the disruption that will cause. But that would be the equivalent if we just stopped oil right now. So it's a transition process that needs to be pushed and accelerated, but through economic means in every way possible. And there's another big opportunity out there that is an extraordinary opportunity, because people have become much more aware of what's going on, and companies are very aware of what's going on. Many companies are doing their very best to neutralize their carbon emissions, for example. There are very large sums of money, and if we're talking about big change soon, you need, if you take an ecosystem perspective, to say, well, here are these guys cutting down primary rainforest. So they are effectively beasts in the jungle who are feeding off that particular resource. And that particular resource, we know, is worth a lot more to the rest of us, to our climate, and for all sorts of other reasons, and the biodiversity it contains, than it is just as paper or timber. So we have to say, well, how can we get a more powerful beast in there who can drive them out? Because you can't ask them to stop. You can regulate all you like, but regulation only works to a limited degree, and you have to police every regulation. So some people want to regulate this and regulate that. Yes, you do need a certain amount of it, but it isn't the be-all and end-all, because you then need to police it. You then need to prosecute it. So your courts and your policing agencies are tied up, watching every corner of the earth. No, there is one way you can change how they behave, and that is through the lure of profit, through the lure of money. And that's the way the world works. And as soon as we accept that and say, that's the premise we need to work on, that's where we go from here. So looking at the amount of money that's hanging over investment markets, we're not talking about millions. We're not talking about billions. We're talking about trillions of dollars, vast sums of money that are overhanging these markets. And already a lot of them are being invested in green bonds and carbon offset bonds. And they are having a certain amount of success, but the scale is still too small. And each bond represents a certain project. And it's good that those are happening. And there are projects happening around the world that are good, but it's not enough, nowhere near enough. It needs to accelerate massively. And many people in the green bond market understand that. But there's also an element of distrust, because when you do have green bonds, you do need very good oversight. So you need what's called MRV, monitoring, reporting, verification. And so there are bodies available. The biggest one is probably VERA, VERRA, which is a verification body, which is basically when a company, when a person, when an institution buys a bond that's a green bond, has an objective in mind, that is a green result in, say, an emerging economy. These are the people who come in and say, yes, they have done it. And we have something called the RED scheme, reducing emissions from forest degradation and destruction. The latest version being RED+. And RED+ is considered to be the best thing that's around at the moment. And I'm not going to go into in detail why it is just not enough and not going far enough and not having a wide enough impact. But unfortunately, a lot of people who signed up to VERA type bonds, RED+ type bonds, are finding that VERA's verification is not as thorough as they thought it was. So the point I'm getting to is there is a confidence lag in these markets. So what's essential now is to have a new generation of green bonds that fill all the blanks, one of the most important things to do, as well as conserve rainforest, is to have indigenous people in them looking after them. They're the experts. They've been doing it for thousands of years, paid as rangers. You need governments who at the moment look at their rainforests, we're taking that as an example, as cash in the bank. It's the silver in the vault. So every time they want some more money, they just sell a bit more. And then there are the agriculturists, the farmers, who buy huge estates. Maybe 2/3 of it or 3/4 of it is rainforest when they buy it, and a bit of agriculture. So that agricultural land becomes degraded. They need to put more and more inputs into it in the way of fertilizers, whatever. And so it becomes less profitable, gets discarded eventually as degraded land, and they keep chomping into the rainforest. Now, if they looked at that rainforest and that rainforest was protected through the bond markets, for example, they would say, well, we get an income from that as rainforest, as actually we should, as those indigenous people should, because they're providing services to the whole world. Because environmental services aren't just something you get locally. They're not just something you have in your hometown or in, it is worldwide. Weather systems and the ecological diversity, the biological diversity that's within them, the potential medicinal value, which is well known to be there, existing and future. There's lots of value that we as conservationists all understand without my needing to go any further into that. So the way forward with these areas, with these pristine, high value, high conservation value areas, I call them HCVAs, is to make them more valuable standing and felt. And that means they must carry an income. The bond markets can be engineered into doing that. So that is one of the ways you could do it, but there are lots and lots of other ways. So we need to fast track high-tech solutions that make things cleaner, that make manufacturing processes cleaner, that makes clean energy more efficient and cheaper. And I'm a very strong believer in something that has a horrible technical term called hypothecation. Basically, to you and I, it means ring fencing. So, give you an example. You get on your airplane flight that you've got to take, and you want to take or whatever, and they give you when you buy your ticket, they may offer to plant a few trees somewhere, God knows where, who's overseeing that. Will they survive? Are they the right trees in the right place? In order to offset your carbon footprint. Far better is to have a modest tax on that, $10 or $20, and that is ring fenced into R&D, research and development, into engine development. And that speeds up the process, because R&D obviously has its own technical limitations as to how fast it can grow, but it does very much depend on the amount of money that comes in, which is why, cancer research needs more money. It does better when it's better funded and it goes faster. So we're talking about accelerating the pace of change, and you can do that as well. For example, we have another example. We have a real problem in this country, in the UK, with water pollution, rivers, lakes, and the coast. And it's very controversial at the moment, because the government won't take strong enough action against these commercial water companies to make them clean up their act. But if, when they were fined, their proceeds of these fines, and those fines were escalating, so they knew each time it's going to be double what it cost them last time when they get it wrong, is not taken away and put in the government's coffers, but is kept in a fund which is they can then compulsorily spend on those measures. Now you can see how that is a kind of, it actually has its equivalents in ecosystems as well. I won't go into the details of that because it's a little bit complicated, but businesses geared to profit need to see profit in benign places, in environmentally benign places. So we need to empower benign actors, economic actors, benign technologies, and this is a kind of what I'm advocating is kind of Robin Hood solution. You take from the rich, and here you take from the polluters, and you give it to the new companies, the new tech developments, the new startups, and you therefore speed up. They're not all going to be successful. It's like you're in a jungle and you're trying to say, well, this beast is doing an awful lot of damage, so we're going to get all these others in because we think they're pretty benign. They're not going to cause that damage, but some of them just don't work out. They don't reproduce, or they're not fit for that environment or whatever. But nevertheless, you always get a certain number that will succeed. So it's really important that ring fencing is part of any future-proofing of environmental systems, that protects those systems and makes them more valuable, standing or alive than destroyed, which is really the fact that they are not is the root cause of all our problems. And at the same time, channel funds into developing countries, because those developing countries are cash starved. They see their rainforests or whatever it may be as basically they're going to spend the family silver because they haven't got enough income coming in. At the moment, their interest rates have rocketed. They've gone into debt because of COVID. We need to be able to help them develop within their countries. It also keeps their populations happy and at home, rather than them immigrating, as we see massively all over the world, because their economies are so strapped. And if you normally give them money, they will just spend it to pay off other debt. But if you can channel that money towards education, health, and green development, then you will find that those economies develop and everyone's happier for it. Education being absolutely key to the whole process. So what about the future? What does the future hold? I'm optimistic. I have all along, and as I say in my book, I am optimistic that if we act fast and we act strong, we go hard at it in the right way, using economics as our template, we can save the rest of the planet. We need not just to stop the rot, but we need to actually restore. That is really important. For a while, before I came to publish my book, and for a while, I felt like a lone voice. I felt obviously there are ecologists out there who are desperately worried, and economists as well. But we went from summit to summit, all the great summits you will have heard of, and each one was kind of like they got summititis or something. They all made loads of promises. They all went away promising to do this, that, and this, that, and the other, and nothing, or very little, was ever done. Until we came to COP21, the big one, the Paris COP. And there was a new sense of urgency, and something, little things happen sometimes. I don't know how worldwide it went. Well, we know that Greta Thunberg went worldwide, but I don't know how worldwide the Blue Planet series that David Attenborough did when he showed the massive amounts of, incredible amounts of waste. That same waste, actually, Thor Heyerdahl had spotted back in the 1950s and 60s that first alerted me to all this. But it caught imagination. It has caught the imagination of the world. People are far more aware, and that is creating pressure on governments to do the right thing. And I do think that business and community has a new attitude and are looking for profitable ways to do the right thing. But it is time to step up. There is a short time frame available, we are constantly assured. And I passionately believe that what I propose, ecosystem economics, is the way to see it through, and see it through fast, and to change the entire way we look at nature from being a profitable extracted resource to being a profitable world resource for everybody to enjoy long into the future. And I think that now is the time to adapt. That's what we're best at. Businesses adapt incredibly well, and we as human beings can adapt. And if we start to adapt now, led by our governments, but also led by individuals talking to each other, doing the right thing, and doing all the things that they do around the world now to bring attention to the criminal destruction of our environment. I believe we have a bright future still ahead of us.